Having problems with your sourdough starter? Well, you're in the right place. Hi, James Brown with Barton Springs Mill. I'm in my home kitchen just down the street from the mill today to answer some questions that we get quite a bit about troubleshooting issues with sourdough starter. And I'm going to jump right in. One of the first ones is, I don't see any activity. What am I doing wrong? Well, perhaps nothing. A lot of times I have to just simply counsel patience. You may not see any activity in the first 24 hours. It's totally reasonable that it may take 48 to 72 hours before you really see any movement, any bubbles, any activity whatsoever. And so you just have to stay the course. Couple of other elements that could be affecting that would be water. If you're using chlorinated water from the tap, I always advise people to find a vessel, fill it with water, and leave it on the counter overnight. And what will happen is the chlorine will evaporate off, and you don't have to worry about the chlorine combating or retarding the work of all your critters in your sourdough starter. Another question we get is about the consistency of the starter. A lot of people write to us and say, my starter seems too thick. If you're weighing your flour and water in grams, and you're weighing out 100 grams of water and 100 grams of flour, don't be too concerned about the consistency. Depending on the flour you're using, for example, if you're using one of Barton Springs Mill's flours, our method of milling, that is to say stone milling, creates a lot of starch damage, which makes the flours very thirsty. So it may look quite thick immediately after mixing, but you'll notice over time, as those critters go to work, it'll thin out a little bit. Ultimately, if you find it too hard to work with, it's too stiff, you can add a little bit of water. Just be consistent in your approach so that those organisms sort of know what to expect at feeding time. If you need to up the water a little bit in order to ease things, that's not an issue. You could go up to 110%. So that in baking percentage, that would be 110 grams of water and 100 grams of flour, and you'll be just fine. Other questions we get about is, how soon should I feed after my initial forming of my sourdough starter? Again, a lot of people start trying to feed it the day after they formed it, and what happens is you start immediately diluting that little tiny colony of organisms that you have going there. You don't give them a chance to get a foothold. So I really counsel, even if you see activity, that you wait 2-3 days at the very least to make sure that those organisms have had enough time to reproduce, because you're going to cut their colony in half when you feed your starter. That is to say, we're going to discard half of what's in this jar, which will leave us with 100 grams of starter, and we're going to feed with 100 grams of water and flour. If you do that too soon and too often, then you're just simply cutting into the repopulation efforts of your organisms. Once the starter is fully established, it will rise and fall predictably. I like to put a rubber band on mine immediately after feeding, and then I can sort of measure the rising and falling. You'll also notice that it sort of domes on the top, and then after a period of time, it will start to sink and flatten completely flat. That's the point at which I like to feed mine. Some people prefer, and this is a matter of preference, to wait till it completely falls. But I think once, especially if you're feeding and you're getting ready to make bread, that time just after it starts to fall is the place to catch it. If you're simply maintaining it and you have no plans for baking, then waiting for it to fall all the way is a viable option. We get lots of questions about all of this wasted flour that you're using in making these starters. There are some great recipes that utilize this leftover old starter. English muffins, crumpets, pancakes. One of my favorite is sourdough crackers that use this. And the sourdough starter, particularly when it's mature, gives a very piquant sort of Parmesan cheese flavor to the crackers. It's very appealing. They're hard to put down. So there are things you can do with it. The other thing you can do is, once you have it fully established, and if you're not using it regularly, is you can cut the amount that you're keeping by half. So hang on to 25 grams of starter or 50 grams of starter, and then feed with equal parts water and flour. When you get ready to make your bread and you need more starter, then you can amplify that by increasing those proportions again, probably 2 feedings before you need to use it at least. Another common question, what flour should I use? Frankly, I think you should use the cheapest flour that you can get that gets the job done. In our lineup, I like using the TAM 105 or the Ruby Lee, usually in whole wheat. I have a couple of starters. I have one that I keep at 50% whole wheat and 50% 00. That way, depending on what kind of application I'm going to use it for, it's very easy to sort of swing it one way or another. And the organisms are used to eating both flours, and it makes it very versatile. You can also add a little bit of rye flour to any of your starters, and it's like throwing gasoline on a flame. The starter cultures really love it, and you'll see it get really active. So if you have a sluggish starter, you can certainly incorporate some of that. The difference between the 00 and the whole wheat in terms of application in the starter is that the whole wheat will look a lot thicker immediately after mixing. The 00 will be just a slight bit thinner, not having the bran in there to absorb so much of the water. I also get a lot of questions about how I maintain my starter. Most days, most weeks, I keep mine on the counter at room temperature and feed it as it needs it. Again, by watching that rising and falling, hopefully that's happening in a predictable fashion. If I know that I'm not going to be baking for maybe a couple of weeks, I can put it in the refrigerator. That slows that action, slows the activity of those organisms, which means I have to feed it less and I have to care for it less. If I know it's going to be a really long time, if I'm going on a long vacation or I'm inundated with bread, which happens a lot of times at the mill because we have lots of bakers bringing us bread, then I will flake my starter. Our video on hibernating your starter is linked below. I hope this answers all your questions, and if you have any more, please reach out to us. If you like this content, please hit the like button and subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thanks.